So hello everyone. Welcome to the second talk of today. Maybe short disclaimer upfront for the online audience. This talk was announced in German, but we agreed to basically do everything in English today. So I hope that's fine for the online audience as well. It's okay? Tone is fine? Okay, then I go on. Okay. So this talk will be about unlocking the power of Keycloak. It's basically about extension development. So you heard Alex talking about new features in Keycloak 24. And this is basically about best practices, or let's say at least sensible defaults for building your own features. My name is Sven-Torben. I'm a partner at Conciso. We're one of the sponsors of the conference. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm around the whole day, so feel free. For the online audience, especially, you will find me, I don't know, on X, Twitter, LinkedIn, under this hashtag, or this tag, maybe, yep. So feel free to reach out by email or ping me online somewhere. That's it. So why am I standing here and talking about extension development? What qualifies me to do that? Basically, I'm maintaining two open source extensions you may know or may not know. Actually, I don't know who uses it. It's like a kind of anonymous thing to me. I don't know my users, basically. But I do have these two extensions. Yeah, and I just don't want to get into the details. So maybe just shortly, the home IDP discovery extension is about finding actually a home IDP. So when you're in a federated scenario, you have multiple identity providers that you want to use for login. It's basically around you type in your email address, and based on your email address, basically on the domain part, it will figure out where to redirect you to which identity provider you should use for the login. And the restrict client auth extension is about limiting access to clients centrally within Keycloak. So you can decide on a client basis based on a role-based access control whether a user should be able to log into a certain client or not. So that's what these two extensions are about. I'm maintaining these for a few years now. If you want to understand what these things do in detail, I recommend you to go to Nico's YouTube channel. The link is encoded in the barcode over there. We did 2 videos and explained within 50 minutes what these things do. And from there on, I think you will find your way to the documentation and everything. Okay. As said, adoption is maybe really anonymous to me. I don't really know who uses these extensions. I know that the sovereign cloud stack at least uses the home IDP discovery extension. And phase 2 does the same. I know of a few larger enterprises that use it. Is there anyone in the audience who uses it? I like to get to know my users. Okay, one? No one else? Okay. Basically, all I see is the number of downloads per Keycloak version I can have a look at. So I know that there's an adoption. There are thousands of downloads for the extensions. So yeah, I guess it makes sense to have these things. In addition to these 2 extensions, what do we do at Conciso? We basically do consulting around Keycloak and do all kinds of extension development. It starts with basic theming, building custom authenticators, user storage providers, basically everything you find an extension point for in Keycloak. I think we have seen them all so far, but yeah. And that's basically what I want to talk about today. So what have we set up as best practices when we build these things? Very shortly, I would like to give a short overview about Keycloak extensions and how they work and what they are. But that will be just a short intro. So basically, you can think of extensions as being kind of plug-in mechanism to plug in new features, things that you need to meet your specific needs that don't come out with Keycloak out of the box. So if there are any custom requirements, Keycloak offers a lot of extension points where you can hook in new functionality. If you want to get an overview of that, look at this server or provider info page. There's a huge list of APIs that you can implement and implementations that come with Keycloak out of the box. I think it's 100 or so, or even more, where you can hook in new functionality. I don't want to go into all the details here, but there's a very long list. But I want to introduce you to how this works in more general, like the abstract concept that lies behind it. And I start with some UML, sorry for that, but yeah, so Keycloak basically offers a service provider interface mechanism. It's basically what comes out of the box with Java Standard Edition. So if you're aware of the service provider mechanism in Java SE, you basically know how this works in Keycloak. So what does it do? It basically says, okay, I have kind of an interface, like a provider interface, and it can then, this mechanism can then start to look up all implementations of this interface, and you can then just use them within code. So in Keycloak, there's always kind of a pair of interfaces that you need to implement when you want to build a new extension. It's the thing is the provider factory and the actual provider. So the provider is a classical factory pattern, if you're aware. So the factory creates instances of the actual providers, and that's basically the whole mechanism. There's maybe one major difference or two kinds of extensions you can build. On the one hand side, you have kind of built-in providers, like, for example, authenticators, mappers, user storage providers. There are implementations that come out of the box with Keycloak, and you can basically build in your own. So for example, when you build a new user storage provider for your custom database where your users are stored, you can just implement an interface that's defined by Keycloak, and Keycloak can use it. And on the other hand, there are totally new kind of extensions you can build, like bringing in your own functionality. And often the question there arises, why would I need this? Because Keycloak actually doesn't know anything about it, so it can't call your interface or work with these things. And I'll get to this later, where this may make sense for you to also use these kind of things. In addition to this mechanism, there are two more interfaces I would like to point out, which I think are kind of essential. So when you start building extensions, on the one hand side, it's the configured provider. So when you implement that interface, it allows you to also configure your custom providers via the Keycloak UI. It's kind of similar to what Alex told about the admin UI extensions. It works in a kind of similar way. You can basically build code within Java, and it will get rendered on your front end, on the UI, and you can customize your own extensions this way, or configure it at least. And then there's the server info provider, server info aware provider factory. This thing allows you to show additional informations about your provider on this page that I've shown before, like on this one. So you don't see it here. When you look at Keycloak in the default configuration, you will see this kind of JPA legacy storage provider. It does that, where it actually tells you what's the database connection, to which database does it connect, on which port is it running. And you can use that mechanism to basically show more information on this info page. Very briefly, how do you write and activate these extensions? In the end, it basically comes down to implement the provider factory and the provider class, obviously. Then you register this with the Java SE service provider mechanism. It's basically like, it's like a single line in a text file, in a manifest file. You package that together in a jar file, and then you copy that jar file within a certain folder of your Keycloak instance, and that's basically it. If you want to know how to do this in detail, like a step-by-step introduction, follow the link in the corner with the barcode. We have that on our website, so there's a step-by-step thing what you need to do when you want to set it up. What I have here is also a short thing how we install this on Docker kind of environments. So we basically use a Docker image, kind of builder image where we use curl and download it, and then we basically copy the extensions into a standardized Keycloak image. So it then gets activated when you start Keycloak. You would see a few log messages that it finds your new extensions, and yeah, it comes up and you can just use it. Okay, that's basically the mechanism I want to talk about today. And now go into details what I think should be best practices when you're working this way. The first thing I want to talk about is extension versioning. So how do I handle different versions of my extensions in combination with different versions of Keycloak? because there's this one thing I get asked a lot, or got initially asked a lot when I started to implement these first open source extensions. And this was basically, hey, is this version ABC of your extension compatible with Keycloak version XYZ, whatever? And I had to answer that a lot. And so the first tip I can give you is basically build in a mechanism within your own versioning to reference the Keycloak version that this thing is compatible. I basically started doing it with just aligning my major versions with the Keycloak major versions. So I can say, if you find a version 32, whatever, of my extension, it will be compatible with Keycloak 23, sorry. So just align this somehow, or make a suffix or something so people can see it when they download it, they have that artifact and they know it's compatible. That really helps a lot to get rid of most of these questions around compatibility, to be honest. Once you start doing that, there's something else coming up. There's this kind of second most asked question, which is basically this. So I've upgraded from Keycloak version X to version Y. Your extension isn't working anymore. So it's not actually a question, but generally then it's me who's asking a question. So have you upgraded to the latest version of my extension that actually is compatible with that Keycloak version? And the answer is generally yes, of course I did that. Honestly, mostly it's not the case. And the question is, how do you find this? Hey, okay, show me what you did. What did you? I installed this and that. And it takes a lot of debugging and talking to people to find out that they actually didn't install the right version. They thought they did. They don't do this on purpose or something. It's sometimes just a kind of maybe a default parameter in some kind of Docker file that doesn't get overwritten from the build process or something. So it's just ending up the wrong version within the new Keycloak image. So here's another tip I can share. Make your extensions version visible somewhere in the Keycloak UI or even on the API. So you can do this on this provider info page. So you can look it up, and I can now say to people, hey, send me a screenshot of that thing. And they are good. So they look at this and they see, oh, it's not version 23, it's version 22. Why is that? And then they can figure it out themselves. It's quite easy. So how to do this? You remember this server info aware provider interface I've mentioned before? What it does, it basically gives you this one Java method you can override. It's the get operational info. And that thing basically returns a map, key value kind of thing. And you can encode all kinds of information in there that you want to show on this UI. For the version, especially, I just use the Maven version plugin, activate this kind of option, add default implementation entries, which gives you the version that's inside your Maven POM encoded into manifest file in the jar. Then you can just look it up and show it on this page. And as mentioned before, you can also, once you build a new provider, you could also put other information there, like I said, what's the database I'm connecting to? What are the configuration properties that I've set via environment variables or things like that? Just to give you a better view on what the configuration of this new thing you've built. That said, once we make this promise to be compatible, like I say my version 23 is compatible to Keycloak version 23, I basically make a promise to someone, right? So I have to kind of ensure that I can guarantee that it's compatible. And the question then is always, how can I ensure that? And I call that my safety net. So I basically build a safety net, and that's another tip I can share, how I do that as well. When you build extensions within Keycloak, you're ending up always in a kind of integration scenario. So within Keycloak, you have some kind of Keycloak internal code, whatever it does. It calls authenticators, mappers, user storage providers. It's just what Keycloak brings out of the box. And then you have integration scenarios where you just say, okay, I need to integrate my authenticator that I've built with the Keycloak internal things. And Keycloak gives you an API for that, so it's kind of easy. But then, for example, when you build a custom authenticator, and that needs to look up a user, which also comes from another custom storage provider, you end up to couple these two things together, and you need to test that as well. And if this custom storage provider, for example, calls like an external database, which is not built in with Keycloak, so or a REST API or whatever, then you have the next integration problem. And you also have your client or your test driver or whatever that's interacting with it. I mean, there's mostly a standardized protocol like OIDC or SAML. But when you build a custom authenticator, that authenticator needs to interact with your user sitting in front of the browser. So there's the next line of integration. And in general, we say, OK, let's do a lot of unit testing. That's the common thing we do, unit test everything. For me, it turns out it doesn't really work in these kind of scenarios. Especially within Keycloak, there's this thing called the Keycloak session. It's kind of this, I don't know, yeah, maybe it's a God object or something. I don't know. You can look up everything. It says, OK, give me access to realms, give me access to clients, give me access to users, give me access to whatever concept there is within Keycloak. And if you need to start mocking that thing, you basically end up mocking or testing your mocks and not anymore what Keycloak does internally and whether the integration works. So this whole kind of thing we maybe know from the test pyramid, like do a lot of unit testing, do less integration testing, because of unit tests are fast, integration tests are slow, unit tests are cheap, integration tests are expensive. Doesn't really work in this kind of scenario. So as I say, that comes from a time where we may had, I don't know, where hardware was kind of expensive and it was hard to get good hardware to run these things on. But it turns out once you are on Docker or something, it's just not true anymore. Spawning up a Docker container somewhere is not really expensive. I mean, I can do this on my local machine. I can do this on GitHub for free. It's basically no-brainer. And when you look at speed, here's a screenshot from a integration test I do. When you look at the times here, it's kind of slow, but tiny, if you can see it. But it turns out the whole process takes me 3 minutes and 10 seconds to build that thing, test that thing, and build a release artifact. So I wouldn't consider that to be slow. It turns out once you are on this whole Docker stack, stop doing too much integration testing, too much unit testing when you're building things on Keycloak. It's kind of counterintuitive to what everyone tells you, basically, with the test pyramid, but it works way better in this scenario. So how does this work? There's this test containers library you may have heard of. So what it is basically a library, for example, a Java library, which gives you APIs to spawn Docker containers. So basically, you end up with a more production-like scenario in the end when you test, instead of having, I don't know, 10,000 mocks. You basically use a real database. You use a real Keycloak instance. You can use a real LDAP server or Active Directory or whatever you spawn. And this basically gives you a testing framework. And it doesn't feel very much different to what you would do with unit testing. It's basically Java code. It looks like you would write a unit test in the end. And especially what Nico has built on top of it. He has this Keycloak test container extension. I don't want to go into the details. Again, there's a QR code if you want to scan it. Check out his GitHub repository. Or stay in this room and on the stream as well. Nico will go into all the details about the test containers extensions in the next talk. Just to point out a few things here, you basically get this Keycloak container Java class, which you can instantiate, and then tell it what image or what version of Keycloak should spawn, how you would like to pull images, if you want to use the cached image, or if you want to pull a new image every time. You can set all kinds of configuration things like environment variables, switch on certain Keycloak features or switch them off. You can interact with the REST API, and it's all basically built in Java code. So that's basically the way you write it. There's one feature I use especially, and I get to that later, where I say, OK, you can either take a precompiled jar file and use that to test it, or to just add it to your Keycloak instance. Or you could use the classes that you currently compiled within your, I don't know, your IDE or Maven setup. That's basically what you see here with this use library thing. It's kind of a switch where I can switch between these things. And that's basically it. And you can use this Keycloak admin client to actually interact with the admin UI. You get that for free as well. So you don't have to really read the documentation of what these APIs are like, what parameters you have to send. You basically get all of this for free in the Java code. That said, one tip I can share, because I was coming from this compatibility thing, right? So how can I ensure that my extension is compatible with a Keycloak version? Test all changes you do to your extension against all the Keycloak versions you actually trying to support. That's from the pull request here. So as you can see, this is basically testing against version 23, but I test against every minor version that's there. Sometimes things change, something gets broke and nobody noticed, and these tests will find out. So what I do is basically build a set of integration tests and then spawn up a Keycloak instance in version 23.0.1, run all the tests against that instance. Good, if that's fine, take the next version and the next and the next. You can do that in parallel, basically. And that's good. So you get a good view of whether your extension will be backwards compatible with all the previous Keycloak versions. And then what I also do is I test it against latest. So why do I do that? Sometimes I don't find the time to update my extension directly. Like there's a new Keycloak version, like say 24 is coming out. And if I don't find the time to do the update right away, I can at least say I test against latest, so I can ensure that my version 23 something is still compatible with 24 or not. So it's like looking at the actual situation that's right. So, and then I can take a look in the future. What I also do is I test against the latest nightly. So Alex just said features for 24 are available on the nightly already. So I can take a Docker image with the latest nightly build that the Keycloak project provides, and also get a look into the future. Will my current code base be compatible with what's coming next, so to say? And that's how I set this up. It turns out it's quite easy. If you're, for example, on GitHub, you can use this kind of metrics build. So you basically tell it, so don't fail fast. If one of these builds is broken, fine enough, just report me the result. And you have a list of the Keycloak versions you want to support, like here. And I add the nightly build, for example, as a kind of experimental thing. I don't want it, if it breaks, it's fine for me. I just want to get a notification that there may be something, there's something in the pipeline which may break with my extension. And that's basically it. And then I just use Maven to execute failsafe or whatever testing tool you want to use. And I pass in the Keycloak version as a parameter. And when I get back to this thing, it basically ends up in this full image name. So there's a mechanism where I just plug in the version and the image name. Yeah, that's it. And then I get a Keycloak instance with that exact version. My extension will be deployed, and I can just test whatever I want to test. That full image name also came in very handy when we had these two versions of Keycloak, like the Wildfly-based one and the Quarkus-based one, because I could just switch that out as well. And regarding this pull image policy, when you're using latest or nightly, you do not want to use the cached version in general. So they update these things regularly, so the nightly will be a new version every night. So you always want to pull these things. So we have a pull policy that always says, okay, always pull that thing. So that's the one side. So what happens when I do changes? That's what I do. And then there's the other side. What happens if the Keycloak project changes something? Like there's a new Keycloak version. And I would also recommend to test it. Test against every Keycloak version that's coming out and all your extension versions. So you get kind of a matrix, which basically tells you, okay, my extension in version X is compatible to Keycloak in version whatever. So that's how I can make a promise that how long will it be backwards compatible? Can you still use it? Or is it even upwards compatible? So if I don't find the time to update my extension right away, I can at least tell you, okay, my version 23 will be compatible with version of Keycloak 24. So I get a good safety net to understand what works with what. And yeah, that even comes handy if you have, for example, a new feature inside of your next version, but someone wants to use it on an older Keycloak version. It says, okay, it will work. I don't guarantee much, but at least my tests say it will work. So give it a try, at least. Basically, the mechanism I use here is the same. I just do this matrix kind of testing. So I have all the Keycloak versions, all the versions of my extension, and then I just run that thing. And then there's this small parameter in the last line, this use library thing. I download the actual extension that I've compiled and provided, which you can download on my GitHub page. So I don't recompile these things. I just take what you would download if you want to use it. So I can be quite sure that there's nothing regarding the compiler or other changes in there. Works out quite well. I can only recommend it. But sometimes things don't work out that well. So something becomes incompatible, and sometimes you just don't know why. So you go through the release notes. You say, OK, there's nothing in there that should break this. You try to figure out on the Keycloak GitHub what has changed. Sometimes you just don't find out, and then you're in a situation where you have to debug that thing. Especially when you're on Docker, people always ask me, how do I debug it? Turns out actually quite, when you're from the Java, when you're a Java developer, you may be familiar with the remote debugging feature of Java. That's nothing too special. And you can actually activate this with these two kind of flags, the debug port and the debug true flag. It's not a Keycloak feature, but it's a feature that comes with the Quarkus, with the underlying Quarkus distribution. You can just switch it on. Then you can hook in a remote debugger on whatever port you specify. It's basically equivalent to this agent library statement you may know when you want to activate a remote Java debugger. Nothing too fancy. One extra tip here, if you want to add or connect your debugger before the server is actually starting up, you cannot do this with the debug port or and the debug flag environment variable. But you can use this Java option down here and switch this suspend gleich no to suspend gleich yes. And then it will start, stop, and wait until you connect your debugger, and then you can also debug the whole startup process of Keycloak. That's something I use always when something breaks, and I can't figure it out from the release notes or anything. Okay, once we make a like a promise to be backwards compatible and we have a certain kind of stability, is there anything else I can do about making this whole thing more stable? And there's a tip I can share, which I say, okay, encapsulate things that you can somewhat encapsulate. For example, what I always do is wrapping configuration models. So within Keycloak libraries, you always get a kind of a context object. Like in this case, when you implement an authenticator, you have this authentication flow context. It basically gives you contextual information about how's your authenticator configured, what is the request the user sent, and things like that. And the first thing I always do is like getting this kind of, in this case, the authenticator config, and build a wrapper around it. Like in this case, for my home IDP discovery extension, that's basically, yeah, just a wrapper. Why do I do this? These config models are most likely key value maps. So you have a key of type string and you have a value of type string, and you start parsing, okay, this string is, I want this to be a Boolean, for example. So you start parsing strings to Booleans. There are more complex scenarios where you say, okay, if this flag is on and that flag is on, that means or what if you have introduced a new flag, for example, that wasn't there in the version of your extension before that? So what's my default value? And all these kind of questions may arise. So I can encode all of this in this wrapper and don't have to have this everywhere in every code line. For example, in this case, I have this config option where I said, should it bypass the login page? So I've encoded the default value in there. I've encoded the Boolean parsing in there. Otherwise, I would have to say, OK, give me that thing with key should bypass login page, or pass that to a Boolean. What if I can't pass it? So you can encapsulate that. And you basically have your own kind of integration layer, if you will, which is kind of stable or changes in the way you want to and doesn't have to change with what Keycloak does. So you basically get a wrapper where you can hide everything Keycloak does within all of the stuff, or separate it from the other stuff you want to do. I also do the same thing for this whole context object as well. It's not only the configuration. I try to do it for all these contract-related information. And that's especially when I need to integrate something within Keycloak where Keycloak doesn't provide a proper service provider interface. So for example, for the home IDP discovery, I wanted to reuse this remember me feature. So when you use login page, you can say remember me. So basically, I wanted to build the same. but I don't want to build all this feature. So I had to try to figure out how does Keycloak use it, and it turns out it sets some internal variables and things like that. And I basically had to rebuild this so that I can use remember me with all authenticators, so if I set it on the username password authenticator, remember me, it will also work with my extension. And it turns out that if there is no proper SPI within Keycloak, you can encapsulate this stuff, and you have one point where you have to look it up if it doesn't work anymore. And you can then basically get your own kind of SPIs like context remember me. I know now I have the remember me feature and I can activate it, deactivate it, or whatever. So you don't have to have this code around your whole code base and say, okay, look this up again, parse it again, put this value in here. It's kind of complexity, so encapsulated works very well. And then there's another thing which I would like to share, which is explicitly designed for extendability or prohibited. So once you have this extension out in the wild, people start using it. And so if you, for example, people ask me, hey, I want to extend this, I want to extend your extension. But I can't call that method because it's private. Can you make that public, please? Or, hey, I cannot, I don't know, inherit from that class because it's final. And I said, yeah, it's final on purpose. I don't want you to do that. Because if you do that, it's basically becoming part of your public API, right? So somebody uses it, you want to change it, you don't know who uses it, so what happens? So you may break someone else's kind of integrations. So I say, okay, make these things final, make them private, and then get into the discussion with your users, because what I actually want to understand is what feature is missing here. So there's a valuable discussion when somebody comes to you and says, hey, can you make this thing public? I'm just like, why? Yeah, I want to do this and that. That's nice. That could be a feature within my extension. Why do you have to build this on your own? Maybe we should talk about you do a pull request and we get that feature in here. Instead, you're building the next extension, which depends on my extension. So it looks like it's blocking people from doing what they want, but in the end, you end up in a very valuable discussion with your users. For me, at least, I get to know some of my users, right? So yeah, so be explicit here. Use private fields, use private constants, limit visibility of the methods you provide, mark all classes final, and turns out that works very well. So that keeps my extensions kind of stable because I don't break everyone who has built some integration. And if you need extendability, basically you can start making your classes non-final, have proper, I don't know, protected methods where people can hook in. And you also have the service provider interface thing Keycloak offers. And if you really want to build a proper extension point, I would say use this. Use service provider interfaces. And when I showed you this, it's not working anymore. Let's try it here. OK. I said, what is this service provider interface Keycloak can't call, right? So you build a new thing in there. Keycloak doesn't know anything about it. It doesn't know what your interface looks like. It can't call your code. But your extension can call your own code, right? So if I want to build my extension and I want to say there's an extension point, why not? I can build a new interface and everyone can use it and plug in their own extensions into my extension, right? So for example, for this role-based extension, I had this restrict client auth thing. There's an extension point which is built this way where I say, okay, I offer you role-based access control on this thing. I also offer you a policy-based implementation. And if you have something totally different, implement this interface and we're good. And I know that's part of my public API. I have to care about this in a different way than about the rest of my code base. Just to show you some code, in Keycloak it's actually quite easy. This extension point I have there is called an access provider. You basically define your interface, what you want to look like. Like it has a few methods here, like is restricted, is permitted, enabled it for. It's standard Java interface, no magic. And then you just have your implementation of that thing. So do whatever you want. And you have this provider factory, as I've mentioned before, which basically builds an instance of your class, your implementation. There's one more thing I would like to share about that, because once you build these extension points, you have to call them at some point, right? So let's say you have an authenticator, And I need to make a decision whether I want to do role-based access control or policy-based access control. So I have these two implementations, and I have to decide which one do I call. And for that, in Keycloak, you have this kind of access provider IDs. It's basically kind of a name like role-based or policy-based. And well, via this God object Keycloak session, you can just look up this provider. So you just pass it this ID and the interface, and then you get the instance you want. But only if the thing is configured. So if it's not, somebody didn't configure it, it's basically said, okay, you get null back, so you don't get an instance. So what to do then? And Keycloak offers this feature to have a default configuration server-wide. So you basically, if you don't pass the access provider here, like it's basically the one difference, you just get a default implementation, whatever is configured in Keycloak. And even if that's not set, so there's no default configuration, that can happen as well, then you have to make a decision, so what do you do? And basically you have two options. Either you define an additional default for yourself, or you throw kind of an exception. And that basically depends a bit on in what situation you are. For example, when I built this Keycloak restrict client auth extension, I initially only offered role-based access control. So there basically was no extension point. It's just role-based access control. So now people using this extension, and I now introduced a new feature like policy-based access control and this extension point. So my default was, okay, always, if it's not configured nowhere, like not server-wide, not locally, use role-based access control, because that's what people would expect when they upgrade, right? So they have the extension, they're using it, they upgrade to the new version. You wouldn't expect to currently do then, I don't know, policy-based or whatever. So be aware of that. On the other hand, if you build in the totally new kind of extension point, whatever that is, maybe it's something totally different, you may want to throw an exception when it's not configured. Because it's new, somebody should have configured it when he uses it. So probably tell them, hey, your configuration isn't correct. Just don't bring this thing up because it may break something. And that's basically the process I use when I look up providers within Keycloak. Okay, so far with this extension development, there are a few things I see in projects a lot when we do consulting. And let me talk about a few things there as well. The first things I want to talk about is custom REST APIs. Sometimes you have to extend Keycloak, you have to build in your own APIs, so you want to call something, I don't know, mass import of users, like upload a CSV file or something. That's what I see a lot. And then there's a question, how do you do it? And what should you have in mind when you implement something like that? So technically, that's not accurate, but in Keycloak, you basically have a kind of a layered hierarchy within the Keycloak code. You have this kind of resources, which are basically your REST endpoints. Like, for example, you have a user resource where you can manage users. You have a group resource where you can manage groups, several other things. And below that, you have kind of providers, like the user resource calls the user storage provider to look up a user in the Keycloak database, or a group, or whatever that is. And there's one thing, it's access control is implemented in this upper layer. So when you call a REST API endpoint in Keycloak, let's say the user resource endpoint, it will do like a kind of access control check. Hey, are you allowed to look up this user, or are you allowed to delete it, or whatever? And if it turns out you are allowed to do, then it will call the storage provider, does whatever it does. So now when people add custom resources, please think about access control when you do this. And there's one more thing, just if you call your own code, fine, do whatever you want. But if you cross-call, like, hey, you look up a user yourself, or you add a new group or whatever, you're basically bypassing this access control mechanism. So be aware of that when you do it. You shouldn't maybe not access a kind of group. You shouldn't add a user to a group. Because basically your permissions aren't set up that way. Be aware of that. So then always the question is, how can I do this? I don't want to implement all of this again. It turns out, it's maybe a bit more. There's this thing called the realm resource provider. That's the interface you have to implement when you want to implement a new REST resource. And it basically gives you this one method, get resource. And you return a resource object, which is your endpoint, your new REST endpoint, the functionality, whatever you want to implement. And what I tend to do is just have a method, I generally call it init, on this resource I pass back, just to initialize all of this access control mechanism. So what does it look like? The first thing you can do in Keycloak is use this app auth manager. It has this bearer token authenticator. You just pass it in a session and say authenticate. And what it does is basically checking your access token. So you don't have to implement anything yourself. It just checks, is the token valid? What user is it? Signatures checking, everything. And once that's, so if you're not authenticated, it will just throw an exception. Done. If authentication works okay, you can build this kind of thing. It's called admin auth. It's just a Keycloak class. You can take the result, put it into this admin auth object, and then pass this admin auth object to an admin permission evaluator. So you end up with a thing, this admin permissions evaluator, and what that can do is then just you can say, okay, hey, auth, this admin permission evaluator, I don't know, users can manage. You suddenly get all of this Keycloak magic that the other resources use. And you can say, okay, can this user manage that group? Is he allowed to add a user to that group? So it's basically all built in. You just have to know it's these 3 lines of codes, and you get all of this magic for free. There's some free lunch on top of it. If you don't implement this realm resource provider, but you implement the admin realm resource provider, it's kind of new. It's not there for long. You get this object for free, so you don't even have to build this init method anymore. So you can just use it. Pass it into your resource, and then you can do all the checks you want to do. Yeah, you get that as a parameter in this getResource method. And then there's also this other parameter, admin event builder. Here's the next thing I can share. Auditability is not a given either. So when you bypass this REST API, it also not bypassing access control, it's also bypassing the whole auditability thing. So in Keycloak, you have these admin events and user events. And so for example, when you create a new group, it will create an entry here. So you can then check who has set up this new group, who added the user, when did he do that? Auditability, basically. So implement that as well. This admin event builder is also quite easy to use. You just have, say, which resource am I calling here? What was the operation? Was it successful or not? And then you get that for free as well. It's not much code you have to write, but you have to be aware of it, because once you do this cross-call from your own REST APIs to some Keycloak internals, it will not automatically do this for you. So when auditability is a thing, please look at that. Then I also see people doing some kind of time-related task implementations, like scheduled jobs or something. For example, for syncing users from a custom user federation, have a cleanup job to remove users for GDPR compliance, for example, disable user accounts, collect metrics, whatever you could imagine doing on a kind of a scheduled basis. What I see a lot is that people implement this event listener provider, which I would call is an anti-pattern, because basically you have to hook it in Keycloak, then you get this in this dialog here, and it passes all the events that happen in Keycloak to this authenticator, but to this event listener. But basically you don't need this to do schedule jobs. Kind of, I don't know where this comes from. I believe it comes from this thing that you need to use this post-migration event. This post-migration event is an event that Keycloak fires internally once it's done with this database migration. So it basically says, okay, I'm ready. I'm do whatever you want. I'm set up. I'm started. Go do whatever you need. But this has nothing to do with these other kind of events Keycloak uses. It's just some kind of provider internal thing. It's not a user event. It's not an admin event. So I don't get why people always start implementing this interface. What I would recommend instead is build your own custom service provider interface. Build something what you call, I don't know, schedule task or something. It's quite easy in Keycloak. So you basically say, okay, what is my provider class? What's my provider factory class? You implement these things, like, for example, for the schedule task provider, you don't need much. You need the interval, you need maybe a task name, You need the actual code that should be executed. That's it. And then in the task provider factory, what you do is basically, instantiate one of these providers and call Keycloak internally. You can look up this thing is called timer provider. And on the timer provider, you can just say schedule tasks. And everything is there by default. You just have to use it the right way and don't implement this kind of event listener thing. It doesn't make sense. Don't forget to deregister your task once Keycloak shuts down. That's another thing, basically. And maybe one. So, OK, if you want to register such a task, you basically implement your own interface, like your schedule task provider factory, which only has this create method. So you create an instance of your task. Task is over there. It's just these few lines of code. Give it a name, give it an interval, the code you actually want to execute, and then you get this for free again. Back to this provider info page, you basically get a task list for free. So it just says, OK, my schedule task extension, there are these kinds of jobs I want to run. Again, remember the server info aware provider interface. You could also put all the configuration options, like the interval, the task name, everything in there. If you want to know how to do this in detail, again, it's on our website. And the last tip I want to share is think about a scenario where running in a clustered setup. You may not want to use or execute your scheduled task on each cluster node. So if you, if you build something that deletes users that haven't been logged in for a certain time, for example, you don't want all your cluster nodes to iterate over your database. Keycloak has this thing, it's called a cluster provider. And basically you can say, call this method execute if not executed. It takes care of all of this, so it only executes it if it on one node and only if it hasn't been executed yet. So it will do all that magic for you. Don't worry. I see people implementing really complex locking things on the database, and so it's all there. Just use it. So that was the last tip I wanted to share for today. Happy to answer questions if we have any. And yes, thank you for your attention. As said, I'm here the whole day. Reach out if you want to. So, thank you.